Tensions are rising within the People's Democratic Party PDP as preparations continue for its 100th National Executive Committee meeting scheduled for June 30th. The party has dismissed a warning letter from the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, citing procedural irregularities and the summons for the meeting. Well, PDP National Publicity Secretary Debo Ologwamba berated INEC for refusing to acknowledge the invitation to the NEC meeting, citing alleged signature irregularities. He insisted that the matter is an internal party affair and accused INEC of overstepping its bounds. Well, Ologwamba also took aim at President Bola Tinubu, blaming his administration for worsening insecurity, particularly in Benue State.
And at that meeting, by a motion moved by the governor of Oyo State, seconded by the minority leader in the Senate, Senator Abamoro, it was approved that the 100 meeting should take place. And then there was a further direction that INEC should be informed by way of courtesy. It must be clear that INEC has no role whatsoever in participating in regular meetings of these bodies that I've drawn to you. They have no role at all. But I haven't established this background. The background is that these two meetings, as provided in the constitution for the bodies, INEC has no role. However, there's an exception. And those are the issues that the Supreme Court has said they are internal affairs of the party. To the extent that when we're holding NWC meeting, we don't tell INEC.
Now, how will the PDP wriggle out, as it were, of this logjam? Dr. Sam Amadi, Director, Abuja School of Social and Political Thought, is here to look at this particular issue. Glad to have you join us on Newsnight, Dr. Sam Amadi. Well,
thank you for having me.
Yeah, good to have you. PDP is insisting INEC can't stop its 100th NEC meeting coming up on June 30th. What's your reading of what Ologwamba is saying or PDP is saying?
I think it's largely correct. Look, there are meetings that INEC has to be there, and those are convention kind of meeting, a meeting for electing of officers or meeting for nominating candidates for election. So what that means that those meetings require INEC because they have consequences that are beyond internal regulation of the party. So if you're going to have a primary, for example, you have to give INEC statutory notice, and INEC has to be there, file a report, and so on. But at the same time, I think INEC is right also in their own internal rules to provide for how notifications should come to them. So it has to be jointly signed by the directive chairman and secretary. But the argument that this is not those in which they require to be notified, in which case they cannot void this kind of meeting or ask that it should be cancelled for lack of due process, is well taken. Now, but beyond that, again, it's also funny. When the law says signed by the secretary of a party, for example, an acting secretary is a secretary. You see, this is where the problem is. I think Debo didn't quite look at that. INEC later was signed by an acting secretary.
By who?
Acting secretary.
Okay.
The letter INEC wrote to them that I cited is by acting secretary.
That's Setonji Koshedo. Good.
So there's a secretary, but someone is acting that position. And the person who's acting has the same virtue as a secretary. So if a letter ought to be written by a secretary, and it's written by an acting secretary, it's my view that it's a valid letter. So beyond the fact that I know what and INEC again is building on previous knowledge that's not relevant, which don't understand as a conflict going on between two persons claiming. So INEC is reading its own popular news that there's a crisis, in which case there's Anyanwu and somebody else, Udokoya, and then in between there's somebody acting. So they say, okay, you have to go back to Anyanwu. That is only makes sense because they are thinking about conflict. But if a party, which is an organization, acts through a valid assistant secretary, acting secretary, that's acting secretary is a person acting in the position of a secretary. Again, so nothing invalid about it. The second point is that INEC is not the one who will, on its own, raise the view that this is invalid. if, for example, the letter comes to INEC and someone else writes, or let's say someone young writes and say, countermand this, then INEC can take a position that the secretary has not authorized this. So for INEC Somoto by itself to be the one doing the advocacy and saying this is invalid when it's signed by acting secretary, INEC has to presume that that's the person acting for the secretary until there's a different correspondence. But the bigger picture here is this is not the kind of meeting as they are saying that INEC could do. But again, if in that meeting they take decisions that are required by the Electoral Act and directives to require INEC's attendance, then those decisions could be rendered invalid by INEC. So
yeah, but the local has said this has nothing to do with election, this has nothing to do with primaries, this is basically internal workings of the party, therefore INEC is overshooting its legal boundaries.
And again, yes, also the question around the Supreme Court gave the impression that the parties are all on their own. You know, if the Supreme Court says courts don't bother themselves about what they do to themselves, okay, then if INEC less so shouldn't be bothered. And that's my problem with that Supreme Court decision. It's both in PDP and in Labour Party, that decision is hanging in the air. You know, if people are contending against who rightly occupies this position, I say the party should, it's for the party. That doesn't make much sense to me. Because the facts is why they are here. People are making contra fact. The court should determine who is the one that the party has authorized based on this process. So I think the Supreme Court checking out in maybe thinking about deferring to political branch. I think jurisprudentially, I think it's problematic. Those cases should be resolved, but resolved in line with the party rules, not handed off as a court has done. And that's the problem everywhere.
No, that's been, if you like, the lacuna, you know, but in the arguments that arise, party, who is who, INEC and all that.
Everybody's claiming to be the right person, and the court says, leave it to them. How are they going to determine it? So that's problematic. So again, another point is...
So how do we get around... Why can't we have a clear law, you know, that even a layman can understand? I mean, taking reference from what is happening in Labour Party, this one claims that, and now INEC and PDP that are quarreling.
I think the two things happening here. One is, I think INEC should be very careful because image matters, reputation of fairness. I mean, if the party are seeing you as compromised, even if they are not, it's not good for electoral credibility.
The optics.
And again, look at what happened last week when the FCT minister, you know, commissions headquarters for INEC. Look, INEC is a constitutional body, determine independence, and the federal government, an FCT minister who is super partisan, clear, he's not hiding it. He says, look, my job is to make sure Tinubu wins FCT. And the same man is giving you a gratuitous gift.
Okay, you're talking about the bit, because I was going to come to that.
It's totally illegal. It doesn't make sense. INEC should have rejected. INEC would say, thanks, no thanks. INEC ought to.
No, but the question arises, does INEC have the capacity in terms of funding to be able to raise that kind of structure if it needs it?
Yes, because the part of what INEC provides under the Constitution for first-line charge to INEC as a form of financial insulation from influence is that its budget has to be approved by the National Assembly. So if INEC needed a building, I was used to be chairman of NEC, chief executive of NEC, we put in our budget that we need a building. So this is funded, you build yourself. This is like a gift. The same thing happened to the judiciary. How can government go and build houses for judges? Say the printer authorized. That is bribe, open bribe.
Again,
yes.
How do we, do we correct what you are seeing as a seeming anomaly?
We need the INEC people to know that they're not part of the executive branch in the conventional sense. The reason why the Constitution stipulates...
But a law makes me understand that they are part of the executive.
No, I said in that sense. The executive branch is big. When you create the independent commission, what that does theoretically, this is what I teach in the university for years, is that the National Assembly and the executive has now shared the power to say, we don't want this body to be attached to the executive because it has regulatory function. We carve it out, give it a status. Even though it is in the executive branch, it's actually, that's why you have a tenure, that's why you have a confirmation, that is why you're independent. Now, that body should not allow itself to be embedded. If you need a project, a building, you advocate for it. National Assembly will appropriate fund for you. But when the president now donates a charity to you, That's a seduction of a sort. That's bribery. And so that's what will happen to INEC. INEC should be very careful how they interfere in party issues, because they create the impression that they are a tool to disarray.
Because again, that was the issue that this Olugabo was raising about INEC working to make the
look
state
at
a
Labour
one-party
Party.
state.
They have the impression, good or right, that INEC is the one who wants to derange us. So I think INEC should be more careful. Again, there's no point quarreling with their meetings, and the assistant secretary, acting secretary is assuming the office of a secretary, and it's a valid letter. INEC should have honored it. So I think that INEC should be very careful. They already have lost total credibility, and they need to rebuild it fast. It doesn't matter who is the chairman. You can't be accepting the FCT minister to inaugurate a building for you. I mean, you're not a parastatal. You are in an election that is going to be controversial. You are adversary parties. The incumbent government is being challenged by political parties. So everything about INEC has to be appropriated in a structured manner, nothing like free gift. Oh, INEC, by the way, INEC doesn't need a building. INEC has a good building. INEC has building. And what INEC now needs now is restructuring and moral reorientation. It does not building. So PDP is right.
All right.
INEC is wrong.
All right. We'll leave it there. Dr. Sam Amadi, always interesting to pick your brain. Director, Abuja School of Social and Political Thoughts. Glad to have you on Newsnight.
Thank you.
All right, you're still watching Newsnight from Nigeria's capital. We're live here in Abuja.